A key fauna catchphrase is, yeah, I can do that for you, no problem. But it really is a problem. It's a problem bomb waiting to go off. Because as that to-do list of obligations to others starts crowding out the to-do list of the fauna's own needs, and she moves further along the continuum of self abandonment, she sows the seeds of resentment, which eventually accumulate to a quantity that needs to be discharged. And oh, yes, it gets discharged as a shower of cack all over a recipient that most likely wasn't expecting that for sure. Hi, my name is Jenny Burrell, and welcome to the Power Years Project podcast, a virtual healing space for all women ready to embark on their radical midlife redesign. This podcast is ode to all the amazing possibilities still to come, all the life yet to be lived, and how we journey to a truly self-authored life. Hello there, everyone. Well, welcome to another episode of the Power Years Project podcast. This is episode number 4, and the title is, Why Do We Say Yes When We Want to Say No? Now, this is definitely an episode for those of you who recognize yourselves as people pleasers, but please don't turn off if you think, nah, that's not me. Because I would say that I am not a people pleaser, but I still, in the right environment, have issues or problems, or am challenged to fully speak my truth. So, people pleasers and non-people pleasers, welcome for this episode. So this is a relatively short question, but with a long and deep and wide answer. And in this episode, we'll be unpacking the constructs of fawning. And if you haven't heard of fawning, it's another element to the flight, fight, and freeze trio. People pleasing, we'll also cover boundary setting, and then we'll also talk about authenticity and authenticity versus attachment theory, in order to get to the bottom of this sometimes debilitating habit, saying yes when we mean to say no. And you might think that debilitating is a big word to use here, but I don't think it is, because when you say yes, when you want to say no, when you're challenged to allow your true, authentic voice to be heard, right there, you're in a place of self-abandonment. And I don't need to tell you that that's probably not a great place to be. So just to let you know that there's a mini workshop within this episode to help you delve deeper into how authentic you actually are. So if you have a pen and paper handy before we start, that would be great. So if we do the quick version of why we're afraid to say no, for me, it really boils down to a fear of rejection and the inability to set boundaries, which is also a fear of rejection. But the thing with boundary setting is that to be able to do it well requires that your primary caregivers or family of origin actually modeled what good boundaries in action look like in your formative years. We have to be taught how to do boundaries because they aren't a natural instinct. And unfortunately, it appears that we are going into unicorn territory here because after months and months of listening to clients and myself, I'm not sure that anybody has been taught or modeled good or optimal boundaries. And that's why we're in the pickle many of us find ourselves in, because of an inability to clearly express our wants and needs without blame and without fearing the negative feedback of the person being boundaried. And the pickle I'm referring to can also be expanded to include the down and dirty resentment, which, when it accumulates, and I term this accumulated resentment, will have you going off like a frog in a sock at someone at a level totally disproportionate to their apparent crime against you. And if you are here on this earth having a human experience, I think you know what accumulated resentment looks like. Okay, let's kick off with fawning. Most people know fight, flight, and freeze as states of the nervous system under duress, but not many know about fawning. In a nutshell, fawning is the use of people pleasing to diffuse conflict, feel more secure in relationships, avoid rejection, and earn the approval of others. It's a mode of ensuring security, connection, attachment, and acceptance, which is what an infant mammal, that's us, we're mammals, and other mammals, is hardwired to do because we're born helpless, totally at the mercy of our caregivers, and without attachment, an infant mammal won't survive. The problem is that fawning is a maladaptive way of creating safety in our connections with others because we aren't honoring our authentic needs. We're self abandoning in order to match or mirror the imagined or real expectations and desires of other people. This means that a fawner will have trouble saying no and ends up being pulled in all the wrong directions and overcommitted because she is so eager to make others happy when asked for help, or even when help isn't even requested. A key fawner catchphrase is, "Yeah, I can do that for you, no problem." But it really is a problem. It's a problem bomb waiting to go off. Because as that to do list of obligations to others starts crowding out the to do list of the fauna's own needs, and she moves further along the continuum of self abandonment, she sows the seeds of resentment, which eventually accumulate to a quantity that needs to be discharged. And oh, yes, it gets discharged as a shower of cack all over a recipient that most likely wasn't expecting that for sure. Seriously, though, it's the breaker of relationships and friendships and romantic relationships the world over because people can't unhear what is said in the heat of the moment, and it takes a relationship of some depth with a high quality of love at its foundation to withstand a cack shower. So, where does the need and tendency to fawn come from, and what can be done about it? Well, like nearly most limiting habits, the seeds are usually sown in childhood. Children learn to fawn when they grow up in very controlling or chaotic environments and internalize the idea that if they were perfectly good or well behaved, they could minimize the conflict in their environment and secure love and attachment. When you have a people pleasing or fawning tendency, you will minimize your own needs ahead of the needs of others and be excessively concerned with pleasing others. But this comes at a very dear price to your soul. Because to be effective at this, you have to shut down your gut instincts, your values, your authenticity, your integrity, and your emotions. Because being an authentic individual just doesn't serve you in securing the love and attachment that you want and need. And just in case you're in any quandary here, this is bad news for your soul. Your soul does not like this, and sooner or later, it will let you know. So, here is an example from my own life. My son, who is 7, had a playmate, and I'm using the past tense here, had a playmate. On a play date at the friend's house, the friend is less than kind to my son and refuses to play with him once my son is already at his home. So my son has a meltdown, but the mother says that she can't do anything about it and does not reprimand her son for basically ghosting my son. Now, I put the word reprimand in air quotes because even the use of that word in this context is an alarm bell for my own how I learned boundaries status. You see, that kid's mom wasn't wrong. Her kid has a preference for playmates, and on that day, it wasn't my son. And even a 7-year-old in this case is allowed to have and state and live his preference. His mother was honoring his boundaries. Now, in my case, my parents would have told me off for being mean and forced me to be nice and play with the visiting kid. They would have ignored my preferences and showed me that my boundaries aren't important. Their very action would have and did teach me that I have to swallow my preferences to be pleasing. It taught me that my boundaries don't matter and can be overridden, and that I'm not the boss of myself. And that is exactly why, when my son said, "What would you have done, Mom?" my knee jerk response was that I would have told that kid off if he was my boy and asked him to play nicely. Wrong. But don't worry, the situation has been corrected since. But do you see what I mean here? It literally is unconscious and very dependent on how boundaries were modeled by our early caregivers. And if they had a less than optimal boundary style, guess what? You, their child, probably does too. So is that starting to ring any bells for you? Personally, I think I can hear Big Ben going off in my head. But don't fear, there are tools aplenty to help you get out of the fawning and self abandonment yes trap that literally work like magic and will take the fear out of finally learning to say no with ease. More on this later in the solutions part of this episode. Next up, let's go a little deeper into boundaries and why we need to get better at voicing them to avoid the dreaded resentment trap. Just for clarity, the act of fawning goes in hand with having porous boundaries, as described by Nedra Glover Tawwab in her fabulous book, Set Boundaries, Find Peace, a must read if this episode resonates with you. In her book, she lists the values and meaning of having clear boundaries as they are a safeguard to overextending yourself. They are a self-care practice. They define roles in relationships. They communicate acceptable and unacceptable behaviors in relationships. They are parameters for knowing what to expect in relationships. They are a way that you ask people to show up by upholding your needs. They are a way to communicate your needs to others. They are a way to create healthy relationships. They are a way to create clarity. And they are a way to feel safe. Nedra states that your boundary building conversations must start with the word I and be short and to the point, with a total omission of the words sorry or because or any other padding words. The tone of the conversation needs to be firm, calm, and clear. And her 4 choices of ideal starting words are I want, I need, I expect, and I would like. So, can you call a situation to mind that needs a little boundary medicine? What would that conversation look like if it started from a way more grounded place using one of the 4 phrases? The key to executing this well is to practice, 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 especially if it's a recurring boundary infringement, or if you feel you'll most likely meet resistance or pushback when it's time to act. So you want to be well rehearsed in order to land your message well and effectively. In a bid to help those who need to work their way into this new way of communicating, I really like these what to say when you need time to think before saying yes sentences. So here's a few. Thank you for your invitation, but I have a prior commitment at that time. Oh, please remember me for next time. Then, thanks for the kind offer. Can I get back to you after I've checked my diary? And oh, thanks for the invite, but I just need to check with my partner. Can I get back to you tomorrow? And finally, oh, I'd love to come, but I only can stay for an hour as I've got another appointment. Is that okay? How do all of those feel for you? I know that when I say them, it feels as if there's space. And that's basically the gift that we can give to ourselves, the gift of space. All right, so we've covered fawning and boundaries. So let's now move on to the subject of authenticity and authenticity versus attachment. So, one of the kings of this subject matter is Dr. Gabor Mate, creator of the psychotherapeutic modality compassionate inquiry, of which I'm a graduate and student. Dr. Mate's famous quote on the subject is people have 2 needs, attachment and authenticity. When attachment threatens authenticity, attachment trumps authenticity. That's worth a rewind, so I'm going to say it again. People have 2 needs, attachment and authenticity. When attachment threatens authenticity, attachment trumps authenticity. I highly encourage you to watch the deeply informative video linked to in the show notes below of Dr. Mate explaining his theory, because I know you'll find it fascinating and huge food for thought. So, how authentic are you? Have you ever stopped to question how close the version of you out there in the world actually is to the you behind closed doors or when nobody's looking? In his brilliantly entitled book, Authentic: How to Be Yourself and Why It Matters, author Professor Stephen Joseph states that the word authentic is derived from the Greek word authentikos, meaning to act in one's own authority. So, authenticity is no soft option for life. Living authentically can be terrifying at times because it means taking responsibility for one's decisions. But the authentic person is comfortable with their discomfort. They know what they need to do and press on, one step at a time, in full awareness that their actions have consequences. So, did you know that there is actually an authenticity scale which allows you to test how authentic you are? Professor Joseph and his colleagues developed the scale to assess the three components of authenticity: knowing oneself, owning oneself, and being oneself, which they deem as the triumvirate of personal authenticity. So, have you got your pen and paper handy? Do you fancy finding out your score on Professor Joseph's authenticity scale? Let's do it. So, there are 12 inquiries that you need to score yourself on, from a number 1 to a number 7. 1 equals doesn't describe me at all. So, that's it. 1 equals doesn't describe me at all. And then number 7 equals describes me well. So, what I'm going to do is read out each of these 12 inquiries, and then you'll score yourself on a scale from 1, doesn't describe me at all, to 7, describes me very well. Are you ready? Question number 1. I think it is better to be yourself than to be popular. How do you score yourself? 1 to 7. 1 doesn't describe me at all. 7 describes me very well. Okay, number 2. I don't know how I really feel inside. I don't know how I really feel inside. Number 3. I am strongly influenced by the opinions of others. Question number 4. I usually do what other people tell me to do. Inquiry number 5. I always feel I need to do what others expect me to do. I always feel I need to do what others expect me to do. Inquiry number 6. Other people influence me greatly. Inquiry number 7. I feel as if I don't know myself very well. Inquiry number 8. I always stand by what I believe in. Inquiry number 9. I am true to myself in most situations. Inquiry number 10. I feel out of touch with the real me. Inquiry number 11. I live according to my values and beliefs. And inquiry number 12. I feel alienated from myself. Okay, so those are the 12 inquiries. And now, if you haven't done it already, sort of number them 1 to 12. And what you need to do is add up the answers, the scores for the items, the inquiries, number 2, number 7, number 10, and number 12. So add up the scores from inquiry number 2, inquiry number 7, inquiry 10, and number 12. Okay, next up, add up the scores from the inquiries number, this is simple, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So add up the scores from inquiries number 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then finally, add up the scores from inquiries number 1, 8, 9, and 11. Add up the scores from the inquiries number 1, 8, 9, and 11. Okay, so now I'm just going to turn to Professor Joseph's book, and I'm now going to read his description of the scores. So, in terms of knowing yourself, and we're referring to the score for the inquiries 2, 7, 10, and 12. If you scored above 12, you probably would like to know yourself more fully and often feel at least a niggling sense that life is not as it should be. Scores of 12 or under indicate that you probably feel you know yourself well. Okay, so now in terms of owning yourself, and this is the score when you added up the inquiries to questions 3, 4, 5, and 6. If you scored above 12, you probably feel that you would like to be more able to resist external influences and stand your ground. Scores of 12 or under indicate that you probably feel a strong sense of self-ownership. And finally, in terms of being yourself, so that's the score that you got when you added up the scores for inquiries 1, 8, 9, and 11. If you scored 20 or above, you are probably the sort of person who knows what he or she likes. You are prepared to stand your ground publicly when you need to, and you are able to be yourself in most situations. If you scored under 20, then it is likely that you would like to be more able to be yourself. So, how did you score? How authentic are you? Answers on a postcard, please. So, it is official. Authentic people are happier. And in his research paper entitled The Role of Authenticity in Healthy Optimal Self-Esteem and Psychological Functioning, Brian M. Goldman demonstrated a direct correlation, and his isn't the only piece of research on this, by the way, a direct correlation between authenticity and happiness. Link in the show notes. So there we have it. Why we say, well, my version of why we say yes when we mean to say no, and a potted journey through fawning, boundaries, and authenticity and attachment. So, how do we be more us? How do we stop saying yes when we want to say no? How do we stay in our adult selves and not slide into our wounded child selves when it's time to speak up? How do we walk the path to know ourselves, own ourselves, and be ourselves, and show up as the same person in all situations and environments? Well, if you were my client, we'd start by curiously exploring one situation where you feel that you betrayed your gut instinct and start to unpick the story behind your fear of what happens when you say no and speak up for your true and authentic wishes and values. I'd ask, how old is that part of you who's afraid of rejection? And what does that feel like? I'd ask you about your earliest memory of that feeling. I'd also ask you about the modeling of boundaries in your family of origin and your early caretakers. And then I'd ask you, how do you want to show up for yourself now? And then we'd walk together through the unraveling process with curiosity, care, and compassion. Because I'll help you to see that you were actually very clever at the beginning of this habit because it kept you attached, and attachment keeps mammals alive. But 30 or 40 years on, it can now be retired because the need to please is starting to bite you in the tuchus and messing with your potential midlife magnificence. And we really can't have that. The end. So I hope this episode was illuminating for you. And if you feel ready for some midlife redesign, you know where I am. Be in touch and take care till next time. Thanks so much for joining me for another episode of the Power Years Project podcast. Don't forget, we've got lots going on the Facebook page, on Instagram, and on YouTube. And I'd love to see you there as well. Okay, take care for now. Bye-bye.